Welcome to 132 Problems Revisiting Mormon Polygamy, where we explore the scriptural, theological, and historical case for Mormon plural marriage. I am so excited to be bringing you my second conversation with Dawn Bradley. This time we talked about the work of a historian, and I thought it was a very valuable conversation. I have to say, this Sunday is supposed to be my 2-year anniversary episode. But because of a series of events, including me being very, very sick still right now, that one is being released next week. And we're releasing the Dawn Bradley episode a week early instead. I hope you will thoroughly enjoy it. And I hope you will all tune in next week as well for that very special episode. But for now, thank you so much for joining us as we take a deep dive into the murky waters of Mormon polygamy. Welcome again to this very special episode. I am so excited to be here for the second part of my discussion with Dawn Bradley, who has kindly agreed to a series of discussions to try to get our way into these topics. And so, Dawn, thank you so much for coming and talking to me again.
Thank you, Michelle, for having me on. And thank you so much for all the work that you do. I actually was thinking about this a lot earlier today. I was thinking, there are difficult topics in the history of the church. This is among the most difficult. And the usual response to difficult topics that we make is ignore them. And you've done just the opposite of that. Very courageously, you've engaged with this topic. You've done anything but avoid it. So I just wanted to give you at the start a hat tip of respect for that and appreciation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. I really appreciate that, Dawn. That means a lot. So I guess we'll go ahead and let our audience know what just happened. We just had a false start. We just barely were getting into the beginning of our introduction when there was a very loud crashing sound. And Dawn, do you want to show them what happened?
Yes. So I had notes that I wanted to use to kind of guide some of my thoughts in the conversation. I had the notes sitting up on a shelf next to me here. And so as I was adjusting those notes, I actually knocked something else over. A Joseph Smith death mask.
So, of course, Dawn Bradley has a copy of the Joseph Smith death mask. And at the very beginning of our conversation, it crashed to the floor. And we're trying to decide what the symbolism there is. I don't know if I know.
Hiram was fine. But and Joseph was unscathed. Maybe that's part of the message. Joseph comes out of this discussion unscathed, Michelle.
Okay, it could be that.
That means.
I just had a thought. It could be telling us that we need to be willing to break apart our perceptions about Joseph Smith so we can put them back together again. So that's what I'm taking as the symbolism. Everyone, you can all let us know what you guys think it is. But anyway, we're excited. So our first conversation, I hope you've been able to watch that, was about faith and navigating faith in this difficult topic. And this time, Dawn wanted to talk about sort of his history as a historian and also the work of historians, how historians approach history. And we kind of wanted to talk about that to some extent so we could hopefully have a good discussion, ask good questions, and hopefully Dawn can give all of us amateur historians more understanding of how the pros do it and how we can understand that a little bit better. So I hope I introduced that all right, Dawn.
Sure, yeah.
Do you add anything?
Yeah, and I wanted to say I have been in both categories that you just mentioned, as if we treat them as categories, right? An amateur historian and a professional historian, right? And for me, there's actually been a lot of continuity between those two categories. And so I can kind of talk about that as I discuss, because in bringing up what it is that historians do, I'll be talking about that methodology, but also be talking some about my story, sort of how did I become a historian and what was that process like, and so on. Yeah. And in our first episode, so I do hope that people have watched that as a kind of backdrop. And I wanted to mention too that Michelle and I, so we've talked about, like, we're going to be doing another episode, right, where we'll dive more further into, like, really into the nitty gritty, right? So the sources, the things that people argue about, what do the sources mean? What's the validity of different sources? What sources should we rely on? And how should we treat the sources, and so on? I want to broach that today by talking about historical methodology. So this will be talking about sources on kind of a higher level, right? Rather than getting into more of like into so much the nitty gritty of these sources. But before I launch into, before we launch into our discussion on that, right, and I talk about sort of how I became a historian and so on, I'm going to say, like, from our last discussion, for anyone who hasn't watched it, or who, like, maybe they watch it, but they don't fully remember because they watch a lot of different podcast episodes. So a couple things that we talked about. One thing that a note that we ended on, right, that Michelle, we agreed on quite a bit, is our relationship with God is direct, right, as individuals. And so we are children of God. And so we don't, our relationship to God it's because of that, because we are God's children, like, our relationship to God is not mediated by other fallible humans, right? So it's not, my relationship to God doesn't go through my bishop who lives down the street here, or through my stake president or other church leaders. It doesn't go through historical figures, right? And it doesn't, our relationship with God doesn't go through scholars either, right? It's direct, right? And so nothing that we talk about here, right, when we talk about, figures from the past, when we talk about historians or scholars, none of that should get in the way of people's direct relationship to God, or should be perceived as threatening that. That's something that we have independently as God's children. And then, like, we talked a lot about to what extent can prophets be mistaken? So, somebody started early Mormon polygamy, right? And, like, whether we're taking the position that Joseph Smith started it, or whether we're taking the position that Brigham Young started it, or for that matter, maybe someone else, right? Does that, if people disagree with polygamy, if they think that was a mistake, do they then have to reject whoever started it as having been a prophet? And so we talked a lot about that, and how Joseph Smith being a prophet or Brigham Young being a prophet is not at stake here, right? We're talking about historical issues. And today, and next time, we'll be getting into the nitty gritty, right, that will bear more on that question of who started polygamy and so on. Today, we're taking a high level approach, but that's just a glance back at what we talked about last time.
I do have to fill in one spot, because that was, we agreed on all of the first parts. That last part, I think we disagree on the what a prophet, what it means to be a prophet, and what the behavior of a prophet can be. And so where I disagree on that is that I think that the president of the church isn't just automatically a prophet, in my opinion, necessarily, especially in everything that they do, right? And so the question for a lot of people comes down to authority. And one thing I just mentioned briefly, but that I've thought about quite a bit, is I love that we have the story of King Noah, because I think that King Noah and Brigham Young, when I look at them, they have a lot in common, right? And from my perspective, and in the descriptions of what King Noah did, and when we read about the life and the sermons and the teachings of Brigham Young, there's a lot of overlap. But the thing that I think is so fabulous is that Alma was able to continue on with the church. He didn't need to be reordained. He didn't need to be given any power or authority or keys, right? And so when Abinadi came, if King Noah and the leaders had at that point all said, "Hey, Abinadi, thank you so much. You're exactly right. We see it," and had turned around what they were doing, they would have had everything they needed. So I guess that's how I view it. I think that people can go very far astray and still be an institutional leader, but that doesn't ruin the access that anybody in this institution may have.
So let me check that and make sure, because I think I'm understood. So in the Book of Mormon, we have King. So Daniel Peterson has actually written about authority in the Book of Mormon and questions of sort of like how the kings, priests in the Book of Mormon are ordained either by other priests or they're ordained by kings. Kings were considered to have religious authority. Their ordination as a king, their anointing as a king, gave them the authority to ordain priests. Priests are consecrated by Nephi as king, by Noah as king, by others as king. So Alma the elder, he got his authority as a priest from King Noah, but that authority was still legitimate authority that he used to baptize and to start the church, Mormon. And so it didn't matter that King Noah was way off base, because that legitimate authority still came from him. Did I understand you right?
That's how it appears to me. Whatever, I'm not clear in my own mind about authority. You know, I have a lot of, I have episodes I want to do about our claims about keys and all of those things. But the story we have in the Book of Mormon makes it very clear that although King Noah did not do what was right in the sight of God, as it explains, the priest that he ordained Alma as a priest, or called him as a priest, however that worked, and Alma went on to establish the Church of God that wasn't filled with corruption. So I think that that's something that we can all pay attention to. I think it goes along with the idea that our connection is to God, right? So yeah.
Right. So we can agree that our connection is to God, and that everything doesn't necessarily need to be staked here on polygamy, that there can be genuine authority and so on in the church today in spite of historical issues.
I think so. That's how it looks to me. Yeah. Fallible leadership. Fallible leadership doesn't, all leadership is fallible. The question is how fallible, right? Fallible leadership doesn't need to affect our connection to God or our connection to the institution. What really matters is where God wants us to be individually. So yes. Okay. We're on the same page there.
Right. So in Joseph Smith's very first written revelation, D&C 3, it tells him that he's gone on in the persuasions of men. It tells him, beware, you can fall if you're not following my spirit, and so on. So even with Joseph Smith, from the outset, there's this idea of prophetic fallibility, right? And one of the things Joseph Smith taught repeatedly was that he was giving people authority. They received the gift of the Holy Ghost. When he was asked if he was a prophet, he said once, yes, and so is everyone who has the testimony of Jesus. He's alluding there to a New Testament passage where it says the testimony of Jesus is the spirit of prophecy. So he's saying anyone who has a testimony of Jesus Christ has it through the spirit of prophecy. To that extent, they are a prophet. He talked about how Moses goes up on Sinai. He sees God. God wants all the people to see him. The people are like, no, please don't make us see God. They're scared. And so Moses says, I would to God that all Israel were prophets. He didn't just want to be a prophet himself. He wanted everyone to be a prophet. This is what Joseph Smith wanted. Now, there are, of course, in any community, including the church, there is a structure to the community, right? So it's not just everybody running willy-nilly doing their own thing. There's some kind of structure. But the idea of the restoration was supposed to be an empowering idea, not a disempowering idea, right? It's supposed to be that people themselves could experience spiritual gifts, that people themselves, they didn't just have to read about people receiving revelation in the scriptures, that they could receive revelation for themselves. And so to use one analogy that I've seen, like it's not, the restoration is like a banquet. It's like a feast where we're invited to participate in the feast, not just to read about other people having a feast.
Okay.
Right. And so, yes, this is supposed to be empowering to us, the restoration itself. We're supposed to experience the Spirit. We're supposed to have that direct relationship. That is a big part of what the restoration is about.
Okay, I love it. I often have said all of those things, that
Okay.
no
Wonderful.
calling gives us better access to God than any other. Everybody has the same access to God, right? We might have different keys to different closets or different things that we are authorized to manage or be in charge of, but that doesn't mean that we're on different spiritual levels or that we have different access to God based on any calling. And that goes all the way up.
Right.
To the
Any person can have within their calling, they can have the influence of the Spirit just as much as anyone else within any other calling.
Right. And we all have the access to God. We all have the invitation to come into the presence of God. So yes, okay, let's get into it then.
Okay.
That's great.
So so for me, so getting into history. So how did I start doing history? What was this path like? So I was 17. The first time that I started reading church history stuff when I was 16. I actually encountered polygamy stuff really early at that point. I read early. My dad got me, I think for my 17th birthday, he got me the book Personal Writings of Joseph Smith, which is, letters that Joseph wrote and his 1832 history and things like that. So I started trying to understand Joseph Smith's teaching, started trying to understand him as a person. I became interested in things like the priesthood restoration events. How did those things happen? I was interested in Joseph Smith as a revelator for the very reason that we talked about just now. I thought, well, I want to receive personal revelation, and Joseph Smith seems to have been a master at receiving revelation, right? He received so much revelation. I wanted to understand more about how he did it. So I had not just curiosity, I did have curiosity motives in doing church history, but I also had spiritual motives. I wanted to understand spiritual things better. That was kind of a pathway into starting to study the history of the church. I started going to the church archives when I was 17, looking up historical sources. I was actually following up on things so I was reading books, but I was also reading like historical articles in Dialogue, Journal of Mormon Thought, the Journal of Mormon History, Journal of the John Whitmer Historical Society. And so I was curious about the sources that these scholars were citing. And so I started going to look at the sources for myself so I could make sure that their transcriptions were accurate. I could see the context. I could gather these things so I could see for myself instead of just seeing what they were telling me.
Okay.
And so I was open as far as what I would find in this process. Obviously, we've all been told things about the history of the church and so on, but I was curious. I wanted to discover, I wanted to explore. I did, like I said, start to encounter things regarding polygamy really early. And I talked about that some in our last episode. I talked about how like my mom had come to discover that more about how polygamy had been practiced in the church that was troubling to her. And so I was able to see polygamy in some ways through kind of like my mom's eyes, that it was painful to her. I thought about like when I read, I didn't very fully understand at the time, but I read ideas that Joseph Smith had practiced polyandry, right? That he'd married women, were married to other men.
Okay.
I thought about this. I started thinking about this on my mission. Well, what if the roles were reversed in Mormon polygamy, and I thought I was required by God to share my wife with another husband or husbands? How would I feel? And that felt excruciating, right? And it's something that I've given thought to more recently to try to understand the experience of people who have had to live in this, and the experience of women who contemplate in the church what it would be like to have to live this way. So I'd feel invalidated, disregarded, betrayed, just like helplessly trapped in pain thinking about this, And so I started engaging with these issues, learning about things that had been written about the history, and engaging them intellectually and also like emotionally, spiritually, right? And I talked in our last episode about why, some people, if people watch that episode or if they know more about me from other episodes on other podcasts and whatnot, they know I left the church for a while. I eventually had a collapse of my faith in the Restoration. And when I wrote an exit letter and I came back 5 years later. But at the time that I left, when I wrote a kind of letter resigning my membership, polygamy and polyandry were things that I put in there because they were things that it was hard for me to stomach what I understood about how these things had been practiced, the inequalities in them, the pain, and so on. But nonetheless, I was open to what I might find, right, in the history. And so I started doing,
Can I ask you? Yeah, I just am curious, when you started going to the archives and when you started looking into history, were you I find that usually that comes because of a motivation of some sort, like were you just a really sort of geeky kid and I want to learn everything, or were you like really a fan of Mormonism, or were you like, there are some things that aren't making sense and I want to understand them better? Do you know what I don't mean to insult you. I consider myself a geek, but my study has been motivated by like, what's going on here,
Yeah, totally. So it was multiple things for me. So I just inherently was a curious kid. My mom really instilled that when I was really little. I don't remember this, but I remember her telling me about it later, that she would always ask me why. We'd be outside looking at, we'd see a bee land on a flower and she'd say, "Look at that bee. What do you think? What do you think she's doing?
Yeah.
Why do you think she's going from this flower to this flower?" She taught me to ask why, and I just never stopped.
Okay.
So I wanted to understand why. And she had a big focus on the past as well. And that got me, I was like a science kid, so I was very curious about science. But eventually that turned to kind of a focus of, well, why are things in the world the way that they are? And so I started getting more into the study of history. And then when I was 16, I actually encountered some sort of quasi-fundamentalist literature. It wasn't actually written by like practicing Mormon fundamentalists, polygamists, but it was written by people in the church who like were sympathetic to like the Adam God theory and things like this and polygamy. And so I started, I just was given copies of these unpublished writings through a mutual friend in high school. And that actually got me curious about doctrine. Well, was polygamy, like, what was the status of polygamy as a doctrine? What's the status of, sort of Brigham Young's Adam God teachings? And then I started to become, so initially my interest was actually doctrinal on those questions.
Okay.
And so I was reading scholarly publications on this, like in dialogue, right? And then I started trying to started going to the archives to look up the sources that those historians were citing so I could see for myself what was taught, because I wanted to know on some of these doctrines, where did they come from? So for instance, the Adam God idea, that there were claims that this went all the way back to Joseph Smith. I want to know, did it? And if it did, I wanted to know that. If it didn't, then I wanted to know, how did this develop? If Brigham Young developed this, like, how and why, and at what point did he develop it? And then I also wanted to know kind of like, how and why did it disappear? Why did it stop being taught? And so some of the same questions, I guess, that people have about polygamy, I was also wrestling with regarding the Adam God idea. Like, did it really come from Joseph Smith or was it Brigham Young, right? Like, how did this develop? Why did this disappear from the church? Those two things are parallel in some ways, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Right.
I assume that you came to the same conclusion I have, because Brigham Young himself said, if no one else has ever proclaimed this, I'm proclaiming it right now. He kind of wanted to own Adam God, I think. Yeah. But he wanted to attribute divine racism to Joseph Smith, which was Brigham's, we know. And I think he also, in my opinion, well, blood atonement was his. He owned that one pretty well. But I think he also wanted to attribute, I guess that's the question of polygamy. Is it one of Brigham's original doctrines, like all of the other Brigham doctrines that we have discarded? Or was that one uniquely started by Joseph Smith, but we've discarded it? Because I don't know of many other Joseph Smith doctrines we've discarded. But anyway. Continue.
So there,
It seems to fit in that category to me.
Yeah. So Adam, God, and some of these other topics would be whole podcasts in themselves, right? But
Sure.
I definitely did. Like I saw that there were times when Brigham said that Adam, God traced to Joseph, and so I was trying to understand: did he think it traced to Joseph in the sense that he thought Joseph had directly said it, or did he think that it traced to Joseph in the sense that Joseph had said things that help trigger
Made
it
him think that.
mind, right?
Okay.
And I actually think it was the latter, right? But as I was looking at this, the origins of some of these things were harder to tease out, but the demise of them was actually easier to figure out, right? Like, how did Adam, God stop being taught? And when I was researching that, I realized that by looking at the primary sources and analyzing them, I was seeing some things that the published historians weren't seeing.
Okay.
Right? And that gave me some confidence. I mean, I'm 17, 18 years old at this point, but that gave me some confidence. Hey, I can do this. I can, this is something where I can not just review what other people have done, but I can start to find new things myself, right?
Make a contribution, sure.
Right, exactly. And so, one issue that I know comes up and that I want to address a lot more right later in this episode is kind of like professional history versus more amateur history. And so I want to acknowledge up front that much of my work I actually did as what would be called an amateur historian, because I just started engaging with the sources, right, and trying to figure things out for myself. Later, several years later, I got a bachelor's in history, right? Then it wasn't for a good while after that I decided to go back to grad school, and I got a master's, and I did paid work as a historian and so on, and I spoke at conferences. So that moved me into like the professional historian category. But there's a real continuity in the work that I did as an amateur historian and as a professional historian, right?
Sure.
I'll talk more about that, right?
Okay.
I don't want to have this sort of elitist idea that, well, we just dismiss everything that quote unquote amateur historians do in favor of what professional historians do, right? So I want to talk about that dynamic and what is the value of that said, what is the value of the expertise, the training and expertise that professional historians have, right? And sort of how do we engage with that most usefully, right? And so I wanted to know early on, what is it that historians do, and like why do they do it that way, right? How do we reconstruct what happened in the past? I wanted to understand. I was literally a kid at the time, right? And I was just curious and studying these things. And so I was reading the work of published historians, and I started picking up, like by osmosis, kind of the professional standards in history, like things that many of which, or most of which you're familiar with, right? So like that first
citing your sources, or go ahead, sorry.
Sources generally preferable, not always, but generally a first-hand source is better than a second-hand source. Or generally, other things being equal, a source that's closer to the event is superior to a source that's further from the event. Or other things being equal, a source that is less biased is preferable to a source that's more biased. Or a source that, this one took me a little longer to understand, but in general, a source that's saying something that cuts against its own bias is preferable to a source that's saying something that goes along with its own bias, right? So if someone is acknowledging something, even though they have a bias against it, that's better evidence than someone who's saying something that they have a bias for, right? Because the person who has a bias against it, why would they be saying it? Where it's obvious why someone has a bias in favor of something would be saying it, right? So I started picking up like historical standards of evidence, and yeah, like you said, like citation standards, right? Like Chicago manual style or whatever they were using, I started to pick up just by looking at what they did, how you do it, right? And so this was a big influence on me, was just reading other historians, right? And so the way that I have come to see it, right, is that historical method, it's like, it's something empowering, right? Historical method would be, we could liken it maybe to like good communication skills, right? Like good listening skills, okay? It empowers us to better understand other people, right? And historical method empowers us more to understand what happened in the past and what other people were thinking and doing. And that in turn enables us to better understand the world in which we live, because the world we live in now was shaped by its past, right? And so I've talked for a bit. Do you have, before I?
No, you can keep going. Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. So when I went to BYU, I started out as a psychology major with a history minor, but with a passion for Mormon history. And before too long, I switched to majoring in history. I thought, no, I can't not do history, right? And so in my first class in the history major, they called it the historian's craft. It's a class it's designed to introduce students to the practice of history. And so we read a book that quoted extensively from another book written by a guy named Robin Collingwood. He was a philosopher of history. So he wrote a book called The Idea of History. And like the main part of the book is sort of like a history of how historians have seen history, right? But the back of the book, the epilogues in the back of the book are all about historical method. They're more about what is history. And I would actually really highly recommend this to anyone, those epilogues in the back of The Idea of History, to anyone who's really interested in digging into kind of historical method. And I started to recognize that some of the things that I had already started doing and analyzing the sources were what he was saying to do. So for instance, he talks about what is the nature of historical sources? How should we use historical sources? So I think that often when we think about historical sources, and I think when I thought about historical sources before I started doing history, I think what I thought a historical source is that it was something that was written in the past about the past, like a kind of account of things in the past. So kind of like you think about, well, here's a controversial one because of the ways that it was kind of rewritten in certain ways, but Joseph Smith's manuscript history, right? The actual history that Joseph Smith himself was producing, that is a historical source it's about the past, where he was in the past writing about the even earlier past, writing a narrative of the events, right? Now, so, and he, in 1832, he had written a little autobiography, right? Where he talked about the first vision, he talked about Moroni, right? So that is a historical source where it's about, they're writing about the past, they're writing stories about the past. That is a tiny fraction of the historical sources that we have. Most historical sources that we have are not about the past, they're pieces of the past, they're fragments.
Right. Letters and
right.
Things
So,
like that. Okay.
Right.
Census records. Okay.
Right. So a letter, if Joseph Smith writes a letter to someone else, it's not an account of the past. It's a piece of that past. It's a fragment of communication between two people at the time, right?
Yeah.
Or we have meeting minutes of a meeting that Joseph Smith was involved in, where there's a conversation between people. That, again, that's not about the past. That's a piece of the past, right?
Sure.
Joseph Smith's revelations, they're not, sometimes they mention things without explaining those things. Often they mention them. So they'll talk about, so DNC 28, for instance, where Hiram Page has been receiving revelations through a seer stone, and Oliver Cowdery is like going to correct him about the nature of these revelations and so on. well, that's not a narrative about those events, because the people involved didn't need a narrative about the events. Oliver already knew what was going on, right? He
Sure.
didn't
Yeah.
him, right? It's just a piece of the past. And so this author, Robin Kellyman, he really explains a lot about the nature of historical sources. And then he says, we can treat our historical sources in one of two basic ways, okay? We can treat our historical sources as authorities, or we can treat them as evidence. And this, to me, was really a key point, right? So what does it mean to treat a historical source as an authority, right? So,
sure.
take that approach, what the questions we would ask would be like, so we're thinking, well, this person who wrote in the past, they knew the past in some perfect way or nearly perfect way. And when we are like looking at what they have to say, we're assuming that their memory is just right.
Right. We're just not looking at, we're not allowing for any critical approach to it. We're just saying this is absolutely 100% factual, everything it says, period.
Right.
Okay, got it.
And so when we treat our historical sources as authorities, then our question is, well, let's say we have two historical sources and they're referring to the same events, but they talk about them differently. There's some differences or contradictions between the two. If we're treating our sources as authorities, then what we ask is, well, which one is more authoritative? And then we go with that one. We just sort of cut and paste that person's part of the narrative, and we ignore this person's part of the narrative that they're giving, right?
Sure.
That would be the authority approach. So the other approach he gives is we treat our historical sources as evidence, okay? So if we're treating our historical sources as evidence, then what we're trying to do is acknowledge that there are different perspectives, there are different biases, and so on. And we think, well, maybe there's truth in both of these, but how do they fit into a bigger picture, right? What's the best explanation that takes into account all these different sources, rather than saying, well, this one trumps that one, so we totally go with this one and we totally ignore these others, right? And so he talks about how what a historian does is like what a detective does. And I wish I could remember like his exact story here, but he actually gives an example of detective work where all of the witnesses, he gives like a story of like a murder, right? It's fictional, but like he gives as an example, and he gives an example of how every one of the witnesses could be lying about what happened, but people don't lie randomly. People lie based on their own interests. So when we recognize the witness's situation and their self-serving motives, then the detective can actually look at the lies told by every one of these sources and figure out what happened and figure out who did it, right? This is the way detective work works. Doing history is detective work, but all our witnesses are dead, and we have to use the different sources that they created to piece together what happened. So when I was at BYU,
Can I pause you for just a quick second? Because this is fascinating, but it's so interesting hearing you talking about it, because I'm assuming that people on different sides of this question are hearing this different ways. And I don't want to make us get into it yet, but I just a couple of the thoughts that are going through my mind, and we don't have to debate them or anything. I just want to let you know how I'm hearing this, if that's okay.
Yeah. Totally.
Because I do really like these approaches of authority versus evidence. But what I hear is we take all of the pro-Joseph's polygamy sources as authority and ignore, like we're not looking at them equally, because Emma denied it multiple times, Joseph denied it multiple times, Hiram denied it multiple times, many other people in that community did, and we ignore them and take the others as authoritative. So I wanted to point that out. And then the other thing that I'm hearing is the last thing that you were saying. Oh, remind me what it was.
Detective work?
Yeah. Looking at the bias. I apologize that I had my brain left for a minute. But that's really interesting as well, because again, I'm seeing all of the massive motive in Utah, in 1869 and beyond, to create this body of evidence. So, and then also the pieces of history, I think that we also learn from pieces that aren't there, like pieces that you would expect to be there. that aren't there also tells us something. So anyway, keep going. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Yeah,
It's interesting
yeah.
because
Mhm.
I'm assuming I'm hearing this maybe differently than you're thinking about it as you're saying it. But okay.
Well, I think that you're hearing it with a specific application, but I don't think you're hearing it so much differently than how
Okay.
I'm intending it, because I'm just talking here about what do
Practices.
historians do? What is historical method? How do we figure
Sure.
out the past? And so then different people are coming from different angles, so they're going to start applying that in different ways. But then the hope is that if we're using method well and having a larger conversation, eventually there will be more and more of a convergence in views rather than a divergence.
Sure.
If there's more of a divergence, it sounds like maybe we're doing it wrong, right?
Something's going wrong. Yes, I agree.
Right. So yeah, but I think you are understanding from what you said, right? What I'm saying. And so you mentioned like where we might expect to have certain pieces of evidence or whatever, certain things, sources that are absent. So there we're talking about like inference, right? So a detective will use inference, right? So a historian's job is not just to say, well, this source says this happened or this didn't happen, and I believe this source is more authoritative than that source. Whether it's sources talking about Joseph practicing polygamy or whether it's sources saying Joseph didn't practice polygamy, the point isn't to say, well, this is more authoritative, so then we can dismiss all these other sources. The point is to create a larger picture where we see where the different sources plug into a larger narrative. Because
what picture explains and incorporates the most sources the best way, right?
Exactly.
Like the model.
What model? And I'll come back to models. But yes, we're thinking very much on the same line. Absolutely. So in Collingwood's approach to historical sources, in some ways it's like putting together puzzle pieces. You want to see how does everything fit, right?
Yeah.
And same kind of thing. It's like detective work. So I'll as I'm going along, I'll give some examples of like how I see, like from my own work, of what does this mean to me in practice, right? Another thing that Collingwood said is that our knowledge of history advances not so much by finding new historical sources as by learning to use as evidence the sources that we already have that other historians have thought useless to them, okay?
Sure.
So let me give an example of this. So when I was at BYU, I was 23 or something, and I'd had this curiosity question emerge in my mind about the Joseph Smith translation of the Bible. So I looked at how in the Book of Mormon, you have lots of chapters of Isaiah quoted. You've got like 1/3 of the book of Isaiah is quoted in the Book of Mormon. And I noticed that there's a lot of, and it has variations from the King James, right? There are changes, there are variations, there are differences between Book of Mormon Isaiah and King James Isaiah. I noticed in reading the Joseph Smith translation of Isaiah that most of those same Book of Mormon Isaiah variants appeared in the JST of Isaiah. So then I had a question, curiosity. Is Joseph Smith having this like re-revealed to him, this much of the same Isaiah text as is in the Book of Mormon? Do you see what I'm saying? Like these places where the Isaiah text in the Book of Mormon and the JST both are the same, but they're different from the King James. Are these independent revelations to Joseph Smith, where it's revealed in the translation of the Book of Mormon, but then it's re-revealed to him in doing the JST? Or when Joseph Smith is doing the JST of Isaiah, is he just looking at the Book of Mormon text and using Isaiah text and using that? Is that why they're the same? Which is it? And so I had these two competing hypotheses in my mind, and what I needed to do is find a way to test the hypothesis. Well, so when I talked to different professors at BYU about this question and how I wanted to explore it, I came up with ideas for how to figure it out. But as I talked to my professors, I was often told, go talk to a particular scholar. I won't name him because he's not living, but this would be embarrassing about him. It's not positive, okay? but like I was told, go to this guy. He knows everything about the JST, right? So after I heard this from like half a dozen professors, I went to this guy, I went to his office on campus, and I told him what I wanted to know. I said, I'm wondering, when Joseph Smith did his revision of Isaiah in the JST, did he use Book of Mormon Isaiah, or did he just have it revealed? And he said, oh, I don't think we can ever know that. I don't think we can second guess the prophet Joseph Smith. You can guess what I thought of that. Like I actually already had figured out a method for answering the question. And here, what I was being told is we can never know, right?
Sure.
And why did he think we couldn't know? Because we don't have any historical sources as authorities telling us. There's no historical source that says when he got to the Isaiah chapters of the JST, Joseph Smith didn't use the Bible. Didn't use the Book of Mormon. Or when he got to the Isaiah chapters of the JST, Joseph Smith did use the Book of Mormon. There's no historical source that says that. So there's no one we can rely on as a kind of authority on this question. But do we have evidence on this question? Okay. So what I realized that I could do, I realized that there were variants in different Book of Mormon manuscripts, that the original Book of Mormon manuscript is the stuff as it's dictated by Joseph Smith while he's translating. That's the most accurate. That's the first layer. Then they copied that manuscript, right? They made a copy. Oliver Cowdery makes a copy to give to the printer for him to typeset from. Well, when he's copying, necessarily he makes mistakes. Humans are fallible, so he makes mistakes in the copying, so he introduces errors. Then when the typesetter at the Grandin Press is typesetting, he introduces a whole other set of errors. So what I did is I compared the original manuscript of the Book of Mormon, what we have of that, the Isaiah chapters, I compared that with the printer's manuscript of Isaiah. I compared that with the 1830 edition. And what I found is, if I remember the numbers right, Oliver, in copying from the original manuscript and in typesetting the Book of Mormon, the people creating those additional versions of the Book of Mormon Isaiah text made at least 22 errors in how they copied the text. Then I looked at the JST of Isaiah to see, were those errors present in JST Isaiah or not? Do you follow what I'm getting at? So So if Joseph Smith had the Isaiah text independently re-revealed to him when he's doing the JST, it's not going to have the errors that crept into the Book of Mormon text. But if he's using the published Book of Mormon text, it's going to have those errors.
Right.
Of the 22 errors that had been introduced by the copying and typesetting, 21 of them appeared in the JST of Isaiah.
Okay, so that answered your question.
So that identifies it as surely as a fingerprint, right? This is like a textual fingerprint. You've got the fingerprint of the 1830 Book of Mormon Isaiah text on the JST of Isaiah. Joseph Smith absolutely opened up the Book of Mormon and used that. He's thinking to himself, hey, I already translated this stuff in the Book of Mormon. I can just use that instead of having to redo it. That's what he does. Nobody tells us that, but nobody has to tell us that because we can see it for ourselves, right? So our historical sources don't provide anything in the way of authorities here, but they provide evidence. And if we think, like Collingwood says, we advance in our knowledge of the past mostly by getting at what's already in the sources we have under the surface, by inference, not necessarily just by finding new sources. So even if there had been a source, suppose there had been a source where Sidney Rigdon said, when Joseph Smith got to the Isaiah chapters, he didn't use any other source but immediate revelation. He would be wrong. I would reject what he said because the 21 errors don't lie. They're a fingerprint. So even though Sidney Rigdon would seem like he's an authority on the subject because he was the scribe for these chapters, I would still reject what he said because the evidence in the sources is stronger than his statement. We can see it for ourselves, right? So that would be an example, I think, of the kind of thing that Collingwood, the kind of approach Collingwood is talking about, right? So with time also, I developed a hefty respect for the historical sources, that even though the historical sources do vary a lot, there are often errors in the historical sources. I started to see with time that there was less, that even where they had substantial errors, there usually or often, I think usually, but often at least, there was some grain of truth in what they were saying. So an example of this, actually, my best example of this maybe comes from later in my evolution as a historian. So this would be several years later when I had stopped believing in the Restoration for a while, when I left the church. I was reading an account given by Diedrich Willers Jr. So he knew the Whitmer family in New York. His father was their minister in their church, Diedrich Willers Sr. So he left this account. He was saying that the Whitmers were like superstitious, uneducated people and so on. And then to kind of give an example of this, he says, when Joseph Smith came up from Pennsylvania, this is during the translation of the Book of Mormon, right? When he came up from Pennsylvania back to New York, he comes and he's staying with the Whitmer family, and he says the messenger appeared, the angel, right, at the Whitmer, well, after Joseph gets to the Whitmer home. And he says Joseph had said that because this was the 12th appearing of the angel, that was a sign that he was supposed to stay there until the translation of the Book of Mormon was complete. Now I remember, even though I didn't believe in Joseph Smith at this point, I remember thinking, well, this plays so much into this guy's biases. He's trying to portray the Whitmers as sort of gullible, and then he's giving this story seemingly in the spirit of showing that they were gullible, right? And so I didn't believe it, right? Well, later I was creating more of a chronology of the translation of the Book of Mormon, the early revelations from 1829, this time period. And I was thinking about how we do know that the messenger appeared at the Whitmer home shortly after Joseph arrived there. He appeared to Mary Whitmer, right? Mother Whitmer. Mm-hmm. And so that there was a kernel of truth there for sure. But then I started to realize, well, D&C 18 was given right around the time that he showed up there. And D&C 18 talks about how, for the first time, about how there would be 12 disciples called in the Restoration. And then I was looking at 1 Nephi chapter 1, which is where Joseph Smith picks up the translation at the same time after he moves to the Whitmer home. He finishes the Book of Moroni down in Pennsylvania. He moves up to Fayette. He begins at 1 Nephi 1, and immediately he translates the part where Lehi has a vision, and he thinks he sees God sitting on his throne, and then a heavenly being, like as bright as the sun, descends, and he's followed by 12 others. And I was like, wait a minute, the number 12 actually keeps popping up in the revelations and translations that Joseph is doing at this exact time. Maybe I was too quick to dismiss Diedrich Willers' account because it actually fits so well with what's going on. So it was like there were adjoining puzzle pieces that fit here. And so even though I could see that Willers had a bias, his bias didn't make me ultimately like throw out his account. I saw that there was a kernel of truth there that fit with other sources, right? Okay. And so, so this again goes to treating our sources as evidence, not as authorities. So I don't treat Diedrich Willers as an authority. I don't follow down whatever he says just because he said it. I'm skeptical of what he says, but where the things that he says fit with other data points, they connect well, they fit together into a cohesive whole, then I'm like, okay, he's presenting something, valid evidence that we can factor in a larger picture, right? So one of the biggest, so I studied not only like polygamy, like in Joseph Smith's time, I was also studying the demise of polygamy and sort of the continuation of polygamy after the manifesto. Did you mention to me before William G. Sears as an ancestor? Uh-huh. Yeah, okay. Mm-hmm. He entered into polygamy or took a plural wife in like 1906 or something. Mm-hmm. This is after the second manifesto. So for those who probably most people know, right, there's the 1890 manifesto formally ends polygamy in the church, but then it's still being secretly authorized by church leaders. Then 1904 is seen usually as this, well, now the gate's really shut. Now we've locked that door. No more authorized polygamy. And yet there are people like William Sears are still going into it, where there's a question, well, was this actually still secretly being authorized? That was a question that fascinated me, right, in my 20s. And so I was exploring this, and I found that I was so puzzled because I gathered a lot of evidence on the question, did Joseph F. Smith authorize some plural marriages after the Second Manifesto in 1904? And when
I can say yes, because in my family history, yes. Sorry, you go ahead.
So here's what I was seeing. If I just looked at the evidence against him authorizing, so there was evidence against it. So for instance, there were people writing him letters after 1904 saying something about him authorizing plural marriages, and he seemed offended. He seemed mad. He was like, you're questioning my integrity and so on. And I came across other sources where it seemed like, if I just took them at face value, it seemed like, no, he wasn't authorizing these marriages after that point, right? And so if I just looked at the evidence that he didn't authorize plural marriages after 1904, then I thought, no, he didn't authorize them. Look at all this evidence that he didn't. But then if I looked just at the evidence that he did authorize them after 1904, I thought, yeah, he did. Look at this evidence that he did. And so I got so confused. It literally gave me headaches, because I was like, why is the evidence so contradictory? Because there was only one reality here of what happened. Why does it look like two realities colliding? And so I came to realize very strongly that just because we have evidence on one side of something doesn't mean that thing is true. What we need is what you were saying earlier. What we need is to construct a model that takes into account all the evidence as best as possible. And then we have to come up with criteria. Well, what do we mean by as best as possible? What makes one explanation better? What are the criteria that we measure one explanation against? So in the sciences, you have parsimony. This would be the simplicity of the model, Occam's razor, right? So the model that makes the fewest questionable assumptions, that has the fewest improbabilities, that's basically the simplest in its ability to account for the data. But that's the catch, it has to account for the data. So Einstein said things should be made as simple as possible, but not simpler, right? Like we have to actually, our account can't be too simple to actually explain the data. It has to explain the data. That's what an explanation has to do, is they actually explain, right? But other things being equal, if there are two explanations that equally well accounted for the data, but one was simpler than the other, that one has the advantage, right?
Yeah.
Sure. So what I'm saying is, just we deal with models. There are different kinds of criteria, and so then like questions of how do we use evidence sources as evidence in coming up with these models and explaining things, those become real live questions. So we're using something that's also called inference to the best explanation, right?
Okay, I do want to pause you for a second. Sure. So I'm fascinated by how you talked about the Joseph F. Smith question, and I think it's really an important one and an interesting one. This is what I'm gathering, because it's a kind of, I guess, something I haven't heard you talk about yet when we're qualifying or evaluating evidence.
Sure.
And so my guess is that you looked at Joseph F. Smith's words and people who were angry that he didn't approve marriage, or people that were like, how can you be turning your back on polygamy, whatever it might be, right? So you're looking at that. But on the other side, I'm guessing you didn't have like a letter of Joseph F. Smith writing. You didn't have like what showed you that Joseph did lie about it were things like, hey, there's a marriage here, and there's children, and he's serving in high callings throughout the rest of his life, and he, like, obviously this is an approved plural marriage. So I'm guessing that it was more the hard evidence that made you realize that the claims that Joseph Smith made were not true. Am I like?
Did Joseph F.
Smith?
In denying.
Yeah, that Joseph F. Smith said he wasn't doing it, and you can find letters about that. But then you can find these marriages that obviously were approved because of the evidence you can see with their life events in the paper trail.
Right, exactly. So,
I'm asking if that's how you solve that.
So there is, right. So we have direct denials from Joseph F. Smith that he's allowing that he's authorizing these plural marriages. But then we have inferential evidence that he actually is. And this inferential evidence can take the form of patterns. And you're right, part of it would be patterns of church discipline. So people who went into these marriages at a certain point, were they disciplined or not disciplined? And there seems to be some evidence that he's actually shielding some of these men for a while, at least from discipline. If they're going rogue and doing these plural marriages, like against his will, why would he shield them from discipline? Or things like this, yeah. And it's honestly, it's been long enough since I've been in the headspace of exploring this specifically that details would be a little slower for me to pull forward as far as laying out some of those evidences. But one of the things I saw was that there seemed to be patterns where the performance of these marriages was sort of pushed further and further from the center of the church, more to the periphery, where there was more plausible deniability.
Okay.
So there were larger patterns in the evidence, and there was inference, like you're saying. We do have people who were saying directly, Joseph F. Smith authorized this marriage and such. And there's even one kind of explosive case of this where the Hawaiian mission president, Samuel E. Woolley, enters into a late plural marriage, and he ends up directly telling the Quorum of 12 that Joseph F. Smith had authorized the marriage. Well, the Quorum of 12, they express shock and disbelief at this, but they decide not to insult President Smith's integrity by asking him about it, but they let Samuel E. Woolley off without any discipline.
Right.
That seems like they know that he actually authorized it, but they don't really want to know that he authorized it.
They don't want to know. Right. They want to give him plausible deniability. So in my family history, I just think this is an interesting story. My great-grandfather was told by Joseph F. Smith to go to Mexico and take another wife. He and his first wife were unable to have children. So, and in the story that we were told, because they had to often defend themselves. No, we're authorized. We're authorized, right? Because they lived in Mexico to get married, but when they moved back, they lived the rest of their lives in Salt Lake. And I believe that my great-grandfather worked at the church building, worked at the church office building. I know he served as mission president many times. I know that, I won't remember which apostle or church president spoke at his funeral, but he was very, very much in favor of the church. And what he was told, at least what we've been told coming down the family story, is that my great-grandfather said, I thought we weren't doing that anymore. And Joseph F. Smith said, I'm not calling you as the president of the church. I'm calling you as the president of the priesthood. And so that's an interesting data point of how he was differentiating that. So that's an interesting story. And then whatever people want to say about it, the fact is we can show that he took a second wife in 1906, that they lived in Utah. But he was told when he was called to be the mission president in Tonga, he was told he could only take one wife. Yeah. So he took his first wife without, so they issued the call and said, hey, we can't have a visible polygamist, so you have to just take one of your wives. So my great-grandmother, the one with all of the children, was left alone to provide, right, with her husband gone. Anyway, so I guess what I'm saying is the hard evidence, all of the children, my grandmother is the oldest child of William Gailey Sears. Yeah. And so she had to provide. Anyway, so we know all of those birth dates, the church callings, the records, the marriage dates. We can show all of the hard evidence. So for me, one of the weighing points that I didn't hear you mention was testimony versus hard evidence, right? And I think that's one where I really do prioritize hard evidence over claims, if that makes sense. Because anyone can say anything, especially if they have the motives, but we need to show the hard evidence, right? So anyway, that's one thing I wanted to add to that, how we differentiate evidence.
Yeah. I think there's a range of different types of evidence, right? And so all of them need to be taken into account, right?
I guess yes, they do. But the piece of history evidence is pretty good evidence. A letter is pretty good evidence, and a testimony might be, maybe we should look at it always depends. You always have to look at the bias or what the people are trying to accomplish, like you said. So, for my grandfather, Bill, I exist. So it can't be doubted. You know what I mean? His marriage can't be doubted, right?
Right. The marriage can't be doubted. You've got hard evidence there. Still the question of Joseph Smith authorizing it, right? Is a distinct question.
Well, I guess that's where we look at the dates and the church involvement.
But then you look at, he was not disciplined. He was kept in high callings and things like this. And so that becomes part of the inferential case, right? The inferential evidence that we would analyze here. Now testimony, I think in some ways, I'm not disagreeing with you, because like I gave the example of like the JST and the Isaiah, the Book of Mormon and the JST. There's no testimony about it one way or the other.
Right. I would call that hard evidence. That's how I use that terminology, whether it's right or wrong. You can look at the pieces and see what actually is there. So if someone said something different, sorry, I can see it. Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
So one way where testimony, sometimes we can sort of test testimony, so to speak, right?
Yeah.
So for instance, there are people who knew the Smith family in New England and who knew them in New York and who knew them in Ohio. There are people who knew Joseph Smith, both down in Harmony, Pennsylvania, and up in Palmyra, Manchester, New York. And so where those people say the same, even if they have a bias, they didn't believe in Joseph Smith's prophetic claims. If they're saying the same things independently, even though they wouldn't have had communication between each other because of geographical distance, right? If they're saying the same thing, we give it more weight than if just the people here are saying or just the people here, because the two testimonies are interlocking. How would these people have gotten the same idea as these people over here? Or if people are saying things that cut against their bias. So let's say that we had people who didn't believe in Joseph Smith's prophetic claims, but they actually acknowledged that he predicted something that came to pass. Well, why would they have a reason to acknowledge that? Because it cuts against their bias. And so I'm just saying the same sort of process of inference that we use with hard evidence, as you're calling it, we can sometimes use, not always, but we can sometimes use with testimony to validate it. And so the same sort of process of inference that applies to one type of evidence can be applied to others as we try to sort of do the detective work, connect the dots, put the puzzle pieces together, come up with a model that best explains the data.
Right. And I do want to add with like pieces of evidence, like testimonies that seem to align from divergent sources, that, you know, the other question we need to ask is there something that we're not yet aware of? Is there a newspaper article that made these claims? Is there some reason that they both would make these claims other than that? Do you know what I mean? Like, we're never quite done. We're never all the way finished, right? So, okay. There's always possible explanations that we haven't found yet. Okay.
Right. So, a couple of examples for me, of historical methodology and practice would be, so I've done work on what we can know about the lost 116 pages of the Book of Mormon, I wrote a book about it that's published. So the first part of the book is what we can know about the history of the lost pages, and the second part is what we can know about the history in the lost pages, the missing narrative. And so we have different historical sources that we have to piece together, again, like puzzle pieces, right, that tell us things about the coming forth of the Book of Mormon, the lost pages of the Book of Mormon, the theft of the lost pages, and the contents of the lost pages. So in one of these, so one of the methodologies that I really stress quite a bit in my work and in talking to other people of history is that much of history is just getting the events in the right order. That once we have the events in the right order, we can see the cause and effect relationships between them. But if we don't have the events in the right order, we really have no way of getting the story right. It's like if we were trying to do science, but we didn't know in which order physical events happen, we could never establish cause and effect. Once you get the events in the right order, you can watch the dominoes fall. So a good example of this would have to do with Martin Harris and this question of, like, you know, when he wanted to borrow the Book of Mormon manuscript, the initial manuscript, and take it home to his family, he was really pushy about it, right? Like he asks if he can. Joseph gets a revelation saying no. He asks again. Joseph gets a revelation saying no. So he asks again. Why is he pestering God? Like, where does he get Where does he get off pestering God, right?
Because his wife is pestering him. Sorry.
So we have a narrative where we think, well, we know his wife was involved in this, right? But then, like, why specifically? And do we have anything that can shed light on this? Because we don't actually have a source that really that spells it out. There isn't a source that says, well, the reason he was so insistent was his wife was so insistent. We don't have anything that says this, right? So can we know this? Can we know why? So something that I did, I was laying out a chronology. Joseph tells us that when Martin was taking dictation for him, when they're translating what becomes the lost pages, that Martin is taking dictation from about April 12th, 1828 to about June 14th, okay? So mid-April to mid-June. So what I started looking at is what was happening at that time in Martin Harris's life, what was happening back home. Well, so Martin Harris, we all know he was a farmer. He was a very successful farmer. That's why he was able to assist Joseph in translating, provide resources for Joseph to be able to translate. That's why he was able to, provide the money for the printing of the book, right? Martin was an expert farmer. Well, when was the planting season in upstate New York? It turns out it was mid-April to mid-June, the exact time that Martin was gone.
Okay.
His farm's up in Palmyra. He's down in Harmony, Pennsylvania, 150 miles away, taking dictation to write out this manuscript, right? On May 8th, so remember, he's gone mid-April to mid-June. On May 8th, right in the middle of that period, there's a notice just after that in the Palmyra paper saying that on May 8th, Lucy Harris Jr., this is not the wife, the daughter, Lucy, was married in Palmyra. Where was Martin? Not in Palmyra. He's in Pennsylvania. So guess who, in order to scribe for that manuscript, not only missed the entire planting season on his farm, but his own daughter's wedding? Martin Harris. So he felt now his motives become clear. He had made his family go through so much sacrifice to help Joseph produce this manuscript, to scribe for this manuscript. He felt he could not go home empty-handed. He was not going to go home and say, Lucy, if you could just see this manuscript, then you'd understand. He felt like he had to have something to show for all that sacrifice. So we don't have a historical source that tells us this is why he did it. But once we lay out the chronology, it becomes obvious why he did it. We don't need someone to tell us why he did it because it becomes evident. So this puts Martin in a more sympathetic light. It also puts his wife in a more sympathetic light. She's been kind of treated like in Latter-day Saint circles as sort of a shrew, right, or whatever. Well, look at the level of sacrifice her family's being put through for this book. We also know from Lucy Mack Smith that Lucy Harris was becoming hard of hearing. Well, there is psychological research that shows that people with progressive hearing loss tend to develop paranoia because your whole life, imagine if your whole life you've been able to hear the people, talking behind you and so on. And suddenly it seems like people are talking quieter and quieter, like they don't want you to hear. And so she has reasons to be paranoid about this. And so once we put these historical events in the chronology, once we understand other things that are going on in these people's lives, they become much more human. There aren't villains here with black hats, right? They're human beings acting out of very understandable motivations that when we piece things together, those stories become clear.
Okay, I like what you're saying, and I think that this is useful. I do want to point out, and this isn't connected to Joseph Smith's polygamy in any way. As I'm hearing you say this, I still think there's a lot of inference there, right? Because there could be other, like we don't know if it's possible that Martin Harris had someone hired to do his farm. It's possible that, there are, so I just want, I'm not arguing with your conclusions. I just am careful to not overstate how certain we can be, because there still could be other possibilities. Do you know what I mean?
There are other factors, but don't misunderstand me. I think the planting still happened on Martin Harris's farm. Okay. I think he had hired hands. Okay.
Right.
However, if you look at the later testimony from Palmyra residents, when they're asked about the early Mormons, including Martin Harris, they tend to say negative things about Martin Harris when it comes to religion, but they say very positive things about Martin Harris as a farmer. They say he was an expert farmer. They say he knew everything about exactly when to plant this, exactly when to do that. It was his farm. He was the expert.
Right.
He should have been there to manage it. That he wouldn't have had a hired hand, would have had his level of expertise. And so I still think,
and I didn't want to.
His wife would have been upset with him for not being there, certainly missing the daughter's wedding. I think those are high level, like solid level kinds of inferences in terms of probability, right? We don't have direct access to the past. We access the past through historical sources that then we have to piece together into a comprehensible picture. So it's kind of like if we had a picture puzzle, 1,000-piece picture puzzle, and we have 120 pieces left, the others somehow got lost, we piece together the ones that we do have that we can, and then we can see what it's a picture of, and so we can fill in to some extent the gaps, not perfectly, but we can to some extent fill in the gaps in that, right, through inference. And that's what I'm talking about here. I'm just using that as an example of historical influence based on getting the chronology down. So another, and I think much more consequential example of this, and a more involved example, right, would be I've done a lot of work on the elect lady revelation.
Okay, before we move on, can I just add one more thing? I'm sorry, sure. I really like the puzzle analogy, and I think it's a good one. And every time you've talked about it, it's brought a couple of things to mind that I just since we talked about it again. But I think it's really interesting because we are going, okay, we have a couple of pieces of this puzzle. Let's put it together the best we can, right? And I think that one thing I just keep thinking about is if we come and like go, hey, look, you have this piece backward or sideways. If you flip this around, look, it fits way better and it makes a different puzzle. So one thing I'm concerned about is that there's a tendency, it feels to me, to get the puzzle laid out, say, okay, we've superimposed the rest, we've inferred it, we know what the story is, don't mess with our story. We overstate how much is there. When there's the possibility that it's like, hey, first of all, you've left out these dozen pieces I have right here. And look, they all fit in right here. And look, if you have this piece turned this way and this piece turned this way, there's a whole other picture. But people sit there and go, don't bring those other pieces. Don't bring, I think that's interesting. So that's one of the things that I find happening in history. So that's the only reason I'm like, we need to still be like, oh, this seems like a good explanation, but still be open to going, oh, I hadn't considered that explanation and those other pieces. So we always need to be willing to do that.
Amen. Okay, I love that, because for me, I mean, this is much of how I would see what I like to do as a historian, right? Is like to, like you're saying, kind of turn the pieces in different ways to see how else they might fit. If history were just as simple as, well, we already see how it all fits together, there wouldn't need to be historians, either amateur or professional, because we'd already know it all, right? The fact is, we know it imperfectly. It's sort of like Paul said, we see through a glass darkly, right? And so because of that, there's always going to be room to refine what we understand. And that may, well, at times involve major shifts, usually more minor shifts, right? But it does come a lot from playing with the different pieces to see how they fit, doing that in an open-minded way, using the best inference, having criteria for what constitutes a good explanation. And so having both creativity in how we play with the pieces, but having rigor, right? High standards and criteria for how we assess the explanations. So it's kind of like in the sciences, I remember hearing people come up with hypotheses, but the hypotheses have to be tested and pass the test.
Absolutely.
Right? And so I remember hearing where I think it was a great scientist had said something, there goes another beautiful theory murdered by a brutal gang of facts, right?
Yeah, so, right.
So we need both the creativity on the one hand, and then the rigor, creativity in developing hypotheses and potential explanations, and a very high standard of rigor in assessing those explanations. Yeah.
Completely agree. And from my perspective, the rigor is what I and others are trying to provide, because we see a puzzle that's missing a whole lot of pieces and has a lot of pieces twisted the wrong way. So that's why we're trying to have the discussion so that there can be more rigor, because I feel like there's a lot of sloppiness in this picture. So, okay, continue. Okay.
Sure.
Thanks for letting me add that.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. Yeah. And that's, I mean, well, we're not coming from the same place on the specifics, right? That's something that I completely agree with, a kind of perspective that I completely agree with.
Okay.
So one of the things that I've examined, trying to look at the chronology a lot, look at things look at the historical source in its historical context, is the elect lady revelation. So this is Joseph's revelation for Emma in July of 1830. So that's just 3 months after the church is organized. This is very early in the Restoration. This is very early in the history of the church. And, you know, the elect lady revelation, it speaks very positively to Emma and of Emma. It tells her she's an elect lady, which is why people call it the elect lady revelation. It tells her that she's going to be, and here we get, I don't want to go fully into the controversy this terminology triggers, but it says explicitly, uses this word, it says she will be, it's speaking of Joseph and Emma, and it says she will be ordained under his hand to exhort the church and to expound the scriptures as it shall be given you, speaking to Emma, by my spirit. Okay. And so, so I wanted to understand better, what does this revelation mean when it's telling these different things to Emma, when it's giving her a sort of ministerial responsibility? What does it mean? And so I realized I really needed to look at the context. When I did, I realized part of the context was there's another revelation that's given at essentially the same time for Joseph. So there's this elect lady revelation, as they call it, for Emma, D&C 25, given in July 1830. Immediately before this, there's a revelation given primarily for Joseph, and then part of it for Oliver, that we have as D&C 24. These two revelations I can show, they're given in tandem. They intertwine in a bunch of different ways. And so I realized if I want to understand what the elect lady revelation is saying to Emma, I need to understand what I'm now calling the leading elders revelation is saying to Joseph and Oliver, and then look at them side by side, look at them in tandem with each other. And then I'll understand both of those revelations better than if I just look at one of them alone, right? So this is
I love that. Yeah.
Getting things in the right order, looking at a historical source in its context. So when we look at this historical source, this revelation, the elect lady revelation, in the context of this other revelation, what do we see? And now, another context that I'll mention here is, like I said, the church was organized in April. This is July. There's a revelation given at the time the church is organized, D&C 20. It's known sometimes as the Constitution of the Church, the Articles and Covenants of the Church of Christ. So it lays out what were the different offices that were supposed to be in the church, that people were ordained to, what were the responsibilities of these offices, how do you do the sacrament, how do you run church meetings, things like this. It's like a revelatory version of like a church handbook of instructions or something, sort of that on kind of a higher level and revelatory. Well, that was given in April of 1830. It was voted on by the church, accepted by the vote of the church in June at the church's first conference, June 1830. This is just the next month. This is just the month after that. This elect lady revelation is given for Emma, so that Articles and Covenant of the Church is another context that we would want to understand the elect lady revelation in, right? And so, but mostly I focused on, I have a paper on this that I need to submit for publication. It's pretty much done. But like, when I put these two revelations side by side, I saw in the first of these revelations, the one for Joseph and then secondarily for Oliver, it's talking about how Joseph had a divine calling and office. Major part of his calling was to bring forth a sacred book, the Book of Mormon. Talked about how he'd suffered and would suffer many afflictions. He was forgiven of his sins in the Revelation. Told him he was to visit the local congregations of the church to confirm the members in those churches, those branches. It told him he was to expound the scriptures to these people as led by the Spirit. He was to confirm the members of the churches. It said he should dictate written revelations as they were given him by the Spirit. It said the church would support him financially. It said Oliver Cowdery was to go on missions to serve as a spokesman to preach the gospel to the world. So when I looked at the revelation given for Emma at essentially the same time, just after this, what I saw is it actually says Emma had a divine calling and office. She has the office of elect lady, right? So people have noticed before, scholars have noticed that the term elect lady comes from the New Testament. This revelation is not getting that term from nowhere. It's from 2 John chapter 1, verse 1. So the very beginning of 2 John. So 2 John is a letter, right, that's attributed to the Apostle John. And it says, it begins, the elder to the elect lady. So John here is addressing, so we have like a male spiritual figure, right, giving scripture to an elect lady, right? He's an elder giving scripture to an elect lady. Well, so something that I notice in trying to understand, well, why is Emma being called an elect lady? Why is it alluding to this passage in 2 John? I thought about, well, who's giving the revelation for her? It was Joseph,
right?
Right? Mm-hmm. What was his office in the church at the time? First elder.
Okay.
In 1830, if you look in the Articles and Covenants of the Church, it gives Joseph's office in the church as first elder. So we have the elder, the presiding elder, giving revelation, giving scripture for the elect lady. It's the same dynamic that you have in 2 John 1, right? You have a male spiritual figure who has this ministerial responsibility and authority, giving this revelation, the scripture for this female spiritual figure who has her own role in the church, who has her own ministry. So it's setting up a kind of parallel between the two. Male spiritual power and responsibility, female spiritual power and responsibility. There's something in tandem here, right?
Very cool.
The revelation for Emma goes on, it talks about how she can comfort Joseph in his afflictions. Well, his revelation talked about how he had afflictions and would have many afflictions. It says part of what she's going to do is to be a comfort for him in his afflictions. So you see, there's something here that's being given in tandem, that the revelations are addressing the same thing, the trials that they'll go through, the affliction, but it's talking about him and it's talking about her in parallel to him.
Right, sure.
It tells him in DNC 24, leading elders revelation, tells him he's forgiven of his sins. In the elect lady revelation, it tells her she's forgiven of her sins. Another parallel, right? It tells him you're supposed to visit the local branches of the church. It tells him to go to these branches. It tells her you shall go with him at the time of his going. So again, there's a parallel, there's a connection, there's an intertwining of the two revelations, right? It tells him he's supposed to expound the scriptures as it shall be given him by the Spirit. It tells him, you shall expound my scriptures as it shall be given you by my Spirit. It tells her, you shall expound the scriptures as it shall be given you by my Spirit. It tells them the exact same thing. Do you know how many people in the church were, there was in the Articles and Covenants, it did talk about different officers of the church, like elders, expounding the scriptures. But do you know how many people it specifically said in the early revelations up to this point were supposed to expound the scriptures to the church by revelation?
I was just wondering that, just those two. Okay, two. I was wondering if that's common. Okay.
Husband and wife, elder and elect lady in these two revelations, right? So she's being given a ministerial power and authority that overlaps with his, right? So it's
Wow.
setting them up in tandem, in parallel with each other, right? So then it talks about how he's supposed to confirm the people in these different branches. Well, at this time, Emma had not yet been confirmed. She'd been baptized, but not confirmed. So the elect lady revelation actually talks about how she is going to be confirmed, right?
Okay.
He's going to be one of these members who will be confirmed. It tells Joseph he will dictate written revelations. It tells her she's supposed to scribe for him for these revelations, right? It tells her, it says Oliver Cowdery's supposed to go on a mission to be a spokesman. So he's vacating the role of scribe because now he's going to go out as missionary. And it says Emma will act in that role now. So Emma stepping into Oliver's shoes. Now, actually, there's a larger history here where originally Oliver had stepped into Emma's shoes.
Right,
right. I talk about this in my book on the Lost Pages. When we can use inference to see Emma's Joseph's first scribe.
Right.
He's the first scribe for the Book of Mormon. How do we know this? Well, they don't say. No source says Emma was Joseph's first scribe. But here's what does happen. Emma writes a letter later in her life where she says, "When I scribed I scribed for Joseph while he was translating," and she says that he didn't know. Well, she might actually say this in her interview with Joseph III. She says pieces of it at different times. But she says that when he was dictating the Book of Mormon to her, he could not pronounce the name Sariah. And she also says he didn't know that Jerusalem had walls. Where would the name Sariah have first appeared in the Book of Mormon? It would have appeared in the book of Lehi, the opening narrative of Lehi, that's been lost. We know scribed first Nephi, it was Oliver, because we have most of that manuscript. That wasn't Emma, okay? And that's not when the name Sariah would have first appeared. It would have first appeared in the original story of Lehi in the Lost Pages. So if Joseph couldn't pronounce it was first encountering the name Sariah, couldn't pronounce it, this is at the beginning, very beginning of the translation. Also, when would Joseph have encountered the walls of Jerusalem? Well, this is when Nephi is going to get the brass plates, right? But that version of the story in First Nephi was scribed up in Fayette by Oliver Cowdery and members of the Whitmer family, not by Emma. It was first the first Nephi version. I mean, the original version of the story was in Lehi. So Joseph was dictating the very beginning of the Book of Mormon to Emma. She was his first scribe. So then later, Martin Harris steps into her shoes. Then Oliver steps into her shoes. Then Oliver goes off on a mission. She steps back. She's not really stepping into Oliver's shoes. She's stepping back into her own shoes.
Into her own.
Right?
It's also when she was on her deathbed after the loss of Alvin, when she finally was coherent enough, she was actually maybe more concerned about the manuscript than Joseph was. She's the one that told him to go get it. So she had a lot invested in it. Yes.
He was very invested in it, very invested. Right. And so
that's fascinating. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah. And so point by point, there are other points here, but point by point, these revelations, this revelation for Joseph in July 1830 and this revelation for Emma in July 1830, parallel and intertwined, and they have overlapping ministries and responsibilities. And the most fascinating of these to me, okay, is that at the beginning of this D&C 24, what I'm calling this leading elders revelation, it mentions to Joseph that he had been called to bring forth the Book of Mormon. Now, it's interesting that it mentions that because that was already, he finished translating that like over a year earlier, right? He's in a different space now where he's now the leader of the church. The book has been finished, printed, published, right? He's now the leader of the church, but it brings that up. In Emma's revelation, but it's highlighting that big part of his calling was bring forth a sacred book, the Book of Mormon. In the revelation for Emma, the elect lady revelation, it talks about her bringing forth a book.
The hymn book, yeah.
She's supposed to make a selection of hymns for the church, as it shall be given you by my Spirit. So, and it says, the song of the righteous is a prayer unto me. So it's saying hymns are not just songs that we sing because they're nice to sing. They're prayers. They're an act of worship. And so for Emma to be given the responsibility, the calling to bring forth a songbook was for her to be given a responsibility to bring forth a book to help guide worship in the church, right?
Sure.
Personally sing. And how is she supposed to do it? As it shall be given her by my spirit, by the direction of revelation. So like Joseph, in parallel to how Joseph had brought forth the book of a sacred book of scripture, the Book of Mormon, by revelation, that's mentioned in his revelation in July 1830 as elder. Her revelation as elect lady is telling her that she's supposed to bring forth a sacred book through inspiration by revelation to help guide the church in worship, this hymn book, right? So if we take the historical source on its own, the elect lady revelation without context, there's a lot that we don't see that we suddenly do see when we put it in the flow of the chronology, when you put it in context and examine it more closely. And there's more that I could go into that I've gone to in this paper about what does it mean for her to be ordained at this point. It turns out the same exact phrasing that's used for her being ordained had been used in other contexts just right before this. There's overlap between the ministerial responsibilities that are spelled out for her and those of the ordained male officers of the church in the Articles and Covenants that have been voted on the month before. So without trying to weigh in on incredibly controversial questions about women and ordination and stuff, I would say this revelation in its context is clearly relevant to those conversations and might bring a different angle to understanding female spiritual ministry and power in the restoration and what that ultimately is supposed to look like, right? But we don't get there very fully unless we use good historical method, unless we create a chronology, we analyze the source in its chronological context, in the context of these other texts and so on. So much of history is getting things in the right order, but then drawing out the implications of that order, connecting the dots, putting the puzzle pieces together so that we see a fuller picture.
I love it. Yes. Okay. That's great. Thank you for going into that. I'm going to have to go read through those again. So thank you.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask questions about, something you asked me once on the phone when we were very first talking. You asked me, why should we believe the historians?
Okay.
We all have the historical sources in front of us. We can all read them for ourselves.
I think what I said is, I think what I ask is, why do we, because we were talking about interpretation, and I think what I ask is, why do we need to prioritize historians' interpretations? If we're all looking at the sources, why do historians, why isn't everyone's interpretation potentially valid? Okay.
Right. And so my first answer to that would be everyone's interpretation is potentially valid.
Okay.
Right? And to point out that when I first started doing history, I started actually doing history and making findings before I went back to graduate school and got a master's, before I even went and started a history major to get my bachelor's, right?
Yeah, you did your research for Brian Hales after your bachelor's, but before your master's.
After my bachelor's and before a couple years before my master's, before I started my master's work, right? And so I definitely was finding a lot of things, both in terms of finding new sources and documents, but also connecting a lot of dots, right? I would have been, when I had my bachelor's, I would have been considered trained to some extent, right? But I wouldn't have, and I was acting in a professional capacity as a historian because I was paid as a historian, a historical researcher, right? But I hadn't achieved the sort of professional standard of like master's degree. I think generally is more considered to divide professional historian from non-professional. If you want to use that educational degree as
I'm sure there's always a hierarchy, because I'm sure a PhD would look their nose down at it.
Of course, a doctorate would be higher, right? And so, so I definitely do see that it doesn't require like training as a historian. It doesn't require a sort of professional designation or lots of experience in order to dive into historical sources, to start working with the puzzle pieces, to start making connections, right? To start making assessments. And so I want to first just like really fully acknowledge that, right? So I'm not saying there's just like this tier where it's like, well, here are the professional historians and everyone else needs to shut up and fall in line. My own personal experience is an absolute refutation of that. I don't believe that. If I had believed that, I wouldn't have been doing history for years before I had credentials, right?
Okay.
I would say in that line that there's value in historical training, and there's value in getting increasing amount of experience using that kind of training, right? And so when I was a teenager, I was kind of cutting my teeth by reading the historians and just trying to understand what is it that they're doing and why are they doing it that way? How do historians think and why? Because I figured if I could understand why they're drawing the kinds of conclusions that they're, then I could see, like, I could understand reasoning, I could understand principles that might have application to help me, it might give me tools, right? So I was sort of reaching around for different potential tools, experimenting with using them. Eventually I started creating some of my own tools for analysis using things that I had seen others do, but building on that, right?
Okay.
And so, like, I would say, I think one reason why this kind of question comes up, why should we privilege the historians, is history is not like a technical discipline, obviously. And so it's not like you and I would both recognize that in order to do nuclear
architecture or surgery or yes.
Right. We need to, there's this whole base of like complex information that has to be mastered in this exact way, or you just can't do that field at all. And history's not like that, because history deals with human beings, and we all have experience being human beings, right? And it deals with understanding human behavior and motives. It deals with piecing together narratives. It deals with weighing the credibility of different things. But more than just that, because it does deal with that, but I also want to avoid falling into the trap I laid out earlier of like treating sources as authorities rather than treating them as evidence. A source could have lesser credibility overall, but still provide a valuable piece for our puzzle, right?
Right, absolutely. Like for my interpretation, sorry, I'm throwing this in because I've thought this every time too. Like the 1869 affidavits all filled out by Joseph F. Smith in his own book, right? I don't think that those are valid, but they do provide us with important information, because they tell us what was happening and what the motives were and what the efforts that were gone to try to claim a narrative. So from my perspective, I agree with you on that. I might just see it differently than you do. Okay.
We would see it differently in the details, but
the same methodology applies.
Still, we would both see that there are multiple stories here, or a big story. And that story is that when we talk about the historical sources, we're not just talking about one context or another. We're not just talking about Nauvoo or Utah. We have to be talking about Nauvoo and Utah. So we have to be putting together
a model.
A total explanation, a total model here would have to take into account Nauvoo data and Utah data to say, well, what did happen in Nauvoo, what did happen in Utah, what actually played, how did polygamy originate? So rather than asking a question, I think the questions that we ask guide our attention in different directions. Questions can be more useful or less useful because they can focus us too narrowly or focus us more broadly, and sometimes more constructively or less constructively. So if we're just asking, did Joseph Smith practice polygamy? That's a yes/no question.
Right. That's not the right.
The better question would be, where did Mormon polygamy come from? How did polygamy start? And how did it really get going? And where does our corpus of historical documents about it come from? And how did it develop, right? And so that's a kind of question where we'd be coming at it from different angles, but we'd both be exploring the same phenomena, right?
Sure. Okay.
There's this thing, Mormon polygamy, it started. We're both exploring, how did it start? We both have models for that. There's this question, where did the corpus of sources talking about Joseph Smith and polygamy come from? How did it develop? Why was it created? By whom? Out of what motives? What things were going on in the background of the creation of these sources? And again, so there's a story there. Now, again, we have different models for how that happened, but we're exploring the same. But if we're both looking at this question of where does Mormon polygamy come from and where does the corpus of historical sources on it come from, we're trying to create models to explain the same set of data. And so then our models are going to have points of connection, overlap, difference. And those models then, we and others would want to assess the different models based on criteria and so on. But that will get us into our discussion for next time,
Sure.
right? About the sources and how do you draw those kinds of connections. As I have learned more, like had more training in doing history, had more experience with doing history, like that has been a huge plus. I do better work now than I did early on as a historian. It's not that I wasn't able to get my foot in that door and start making discoveries pretty early. I was, but I feel like the things that I'm finding now are bigger, right? Like I recognize an evolution in myself. And so if I were to think about, even though history is not a technical discipline, right? You have several children. I know that I can't recall how many, but like, if I have a couple sons, right? But if I were parenting for the first time and I wanted to know more about how to parent my child well, right? Parenting's not a technical discipline, right? Where you have to do all this training and memorize all these facts and so on. But I would still see the value in talking to an experienced parent of several children over just asking my neighbor who doesn't have experience or doesn't have much, right? So there's and I don't fully like that analogy, okay? But I'm just saying that even outside of technical disciplines, we generally recognize that there's value in experience, that there's value in training. And so I wouldn't want history to be seen as something that's an exception to that, because I think it's decidedly not an exception to that.
So I actually do like that analogy. I think it's a very good one because parenting certification isn't a widely recognized thing, right? Like many of us read a lot of books and maybe went to a lot of different clinics or courses, or, we tried to learn what we could about parenting, and then we tried to do our best. And then I do think experience absolutely comes into play, right? But your work is also probably better because you have that many more years of experience, right? And I do think that getting training is valuable. I'm not poo-pooing it. All I'm saying is I don't think that we should say like, oh, she has not only her bachelor's, but her master's. Oh, okay, I'll claim I have my PhD in parenting with the family that I've raised, that I'm raising. So therefore, do you know what I mean? Like, therefore, I'm the one with all the answers. Even like we recognize that that's not how it works. And even in parenting, we recognize, we see, oh, that's good parenting because I'm seeing it happen. It's not based on a certification or a degree or a hierarchy. It's just like, I see good parenting and I see not so good parenting. And I think that does play in a lot with history. Like we see, ooh, that's good historical work. That's a good source brought forth, or that's a really good argument made and backed up well, or it's not. And it shouldn't matter as much who's doing it as what it is they're doing. That's what I'm like, the proof is in the pudding, not in the certification of the chef.
Exactly. That final analogy I love. Okay, perfect.
Okay.
Yes. Okay.
Good.
And so what I want to do in this kind of discussion from my angle, right, is not to come at it from an angle of sort of disempowerment and say, well, so-and-so is not a trained historian, and so they don't have anything valid to contribute to this conversation. Not at all. Pointing again to myself that I was doing history before I was a trained historian, right?
Right.
And so I actually want to approach it from a vantage point of empowerment, right? I see part of that empowerment as trying to understand historical methodology. What is it that historians, not just in the space of Joseph Smith and polygamy, but historians in general, what is it that they do? How do they do it? And why do they do it that way? And I think that that is an empowering thing because it gives people more tools and more perspectives that they can use, whether they're professional historians or not, that the more that there's an understanding of that they can engage with that, it enhances their own toolkit in order to do their own work and see things for themselves and not feel like they just have to rely on people who are considered experts or whatever, right? But like, and I value expertise, but I don't, do you see what I'm saying? I'm trying to.
Yeah, it's the difference between evidence and authoritative. Your
Right.
expertise doesn't make you authoritative. It does make us say, oh, you might have something good. Then we'll look at it and see if it's good, right?
Right.
Your expertise is evidence, but it's not authority.
Right.
I guess is how I would describe
And I think that one of the things that professional historians tend to have an advantage on is that they have been taught a lot about, well, some concrete things they understand about different types of documents from a certain era and so on that people wouldn't otherwise understand, that they understand the context of the era.
So that's your expertise, where your expertise comes into play because you've studied it a lot. Okay.
So one area where expertise could particularly help is in rigor, right? Or where it should help at least, right? Is we need to have professional history community has developed a set of standards, right, for assessing evidence, right? And so new interpretations need to be generated. That's the creativity aspect, which is vital to advancing in our knowledge of history. If we're not going to exercise creativity, basically all we can do is just repeat what people said in the past, right or wrong.
Right.
So creativity plays a real role, but then rigor, just like in science, right? We develop creative hypotheses. We have to test them against a high level of rigor, a high standard of criteria. And so something that else that I want to say is for people who are skeptical, those who are skeptical that Joseph Smith practiced polygamy, I would actually like to see where these people enter into, and I realize that there are barriers, but there are barriers maybe from different directions, okay? To enter into like a larger conversation of scholarship on this, but with the recognition that what that means is that scholars actually have to be convinced of the arguments, right? And so I think, I can't remember who I was talking with because I've actually talked with
a couple of us.
Well, yeah. Jeremy, please help me with Jeremy's last name.
Jeremy Hoop.
Jeremy Hoop, that's right. Mm-hmm. Talked with Jeremy. I've talked with
Rob Fotheringham.
A little bit. I need to talk significantly more with him, hear more of his story and approach. I heard from someone in discussing this was that historians are just kind of, professional historians are just kind of set in a certain narrative. And so it's sort of impossible to sort of break them out of that. I think if you actually look at the academy thrives on novelty. If someone's an up and coming scholar, let's say they're fresh out of graduate school and they want to make a splash, they want to establish themselves in a career track in their discipline, including history, what they really need to do is to come up with something original, to come up with something new. So the very fact that there is a sort of established academic narrative about Joseph Smith and polygamy, that's not actually a bar for someone coming in with a new narrative. That's actually something that if they
it's an opportunity
of rigor, it would be an opportunity because the academy thrives on that. That's how people break through in their careers. Is they come up with something new, right? The thing is that it would have to be done in a way that it would actually convince people in that community, right? So I'm kind of laying out an opportunity and a challenge, right?
Mm-hmm.
Saying this is fully possible, right, for people to do, but it's important, I think, for various reasons to try to understand what are the historians doing and why are they doing it that way? Why do the historians see things the way that they do? Because clearly there's value in it, historical training and experience. And so understanding, as I was trying to do earlier in my life, what are the historians doing and why helped me to better do what historians do, to try to better reconstruct the past. But it's also going to be necessary if people coming from any angle of new interpretation want to, if they want to be given, if they want to have a place at the table, right, they would need to show to the community, the scholarly community, hey, we understand the methodology, we understand what you're doing, and here's how what we're doing fits into that. You see what I'm saying?
Okay. Yes, and I love it. I have a couple of maybe tricky questions for you. Is that
Sure.
okay?
Yeah, sure.
So so it's interesting to me because the Mormon polygamy is a tricky topic because there's more motivation in it than there is in a lot of other history.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, of course, there's motivation in terms of like, was Thomas Jefferson sleeping with Sally Hemings, right? Because people want to make him a hero or make him not a hero, right? So there can be emotion involved and motivation, but Mormon polygamy, like, it's hugely motivated. People on both sides desperately need Joseph Smith to be the originator, and for many ways, for a variety of reasons. So it does provide an additional challenge. And so what I find interesting is that the experts on Mormon polygamy, at least from what I have seen, generally are considered to be, at least in the church, well, I was going to say Don Bradley, yes, but Brian Hales and Todd Compton, right? Those are the books that you're told to read, Brian Hales and Todd Compton. And so Todd Compton did not have expertise or specialty in even American history, let alone Mormon history. He was an ancient historian, right?
Sure.
Who was given a grant. So he even said, that wasn't my field, right?
Sure.
And then Brian Hales is not a trained historian,
Sure.
right? So that's why, and yet those books are just taken as authoritative. When I read through them, I feel like I do have actually quite a good grasp of historical methodology. A lot of it is somewhat common sense. And then as you start doing work, and as you, like you said, as you read, like, just so you know, like, very little that we've discussed here has surprised me or has been like, oh, I didn't anticipate that, right? That's the methodology I do my best to employ. So I'll ask the easier of the two tricky questions first, if that's okay.
Sure.
My first question is, when people say, okay, Michelle, I hear that you're saying this, but all of the historians say, Don Bradley says, Brian Hill says, Todd Compton says, so I don't need to think anymore. The experts have spoken. We're done. You're wrong. What would your response be to that for people who aren't even interested or open to the evidence that I'm trying to show because the experts have spoken?
Okay. I have different thoughts kind of going different directions on this. So we live in a world of specialization and exchange. Our modern world is really built on that. So we have billions of people hooked into a larger market, right? Where some people specialize in one thing, some people specialize in another. And ultimately, we're all beneficiaries of that. If we each had to do each thing ourselves or specialize in everything, to specialize in everything is to specialize in nothing, right? And so no one would become really good at anything. So we thrive in our society. Our lives, the quality of our lives on all different levels, not just like in terms of like the material objects that we have, but the quality of medical care that we get, the quality of service we get on our cars, the quality of service that we get from counselors or whatever. It's all built on this. So I do tend to think in terms of at least a sort of provisional, that in our society in general, we tend to give a sort of provisional grant of weight to expertise, right? so where I would disagree, so I see that. Where I would disagree with the criticism that you're describing for you is that it's taking that and it's making it into an absolute, right? That just because there's value in expertise, that expertise has absolute value. The experts are always right, and so on, which obviously isn't the case. And there is also value in seeing, in understanding why expertise is valuable and what the experts do, particularly for areas that we're very, very interested in, right? So if let's say that I want to know how to eat more healthily, and so I consult dietitians, and it turns out that there are a lot of conflicting views even on healthy eating, right? But like, let's say I consult dietitians and so on, medical people who've written about healthy eating. I could go at this on the level of very basic advice. I could say, well, they say eat more vegetables, they say do this, that, and then I'll just do that because they say to do it, and they're the experts, right? Now, I think there's validity in doing that, and nobody can look deeply into every subject that impacts our lives, right? But there could be an advantage for me in actually learning more about nutrition, how the body works, how the things that I eat actually are processed in my body, how they affect my health. So I could go with just like the surface level advice from experts in this area, and that benefits me. But I could also go to a deeper level to understand why do they give this advice? What actually is healthy about eating in a certain way? And that actually could help me to make better choices in my eating because I understand the principles underlying the advice rather than just a to-do list on the advice, right? And so I think that in various ways, in dealing with experts, like we don't necessarily, and sometimes experts are wrong, and that's another thing, right? And there we get into complexities about how much weight do we give to expert opinion? When do we differ from expert opinion? And so on. And I think those are complex questions that are actually a big deal in our society right now, because I think that actually we're experiencing a time right now when there's more of a sort of populist understanding that's sort of against elites and experts, right, and calling them into question.
I think that comes around when we have individual people claiming to, for example, be the science. Mm-hmm. You know, we famously have Anthony Fauci said, "I am the science," mm-hmm. which is an utterly ridiculous claim. All it means is you have all of the power, which isn't good, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think that when we, like, I guess from my perspective, I do think that specialization is a really important thing. You know, like even MDs, physicians, if they do a specialization, that's more years of training into a field, right? And so like, anyway, so I think it's interesting because I guess I just always wish we would talk about sources, not people, you know? And so it's really, anyway, so I guess that's an interesting answer. I guess I'm always thinking, just look at the evidence. Don't name a person, look at the evidence, right? And so if there's like a medical hierarchy or a scientific hierarchy and they're claiming one thing, but then we look at the evidence and they're just wrong, right? That happens. And so anyway, so okay. So I guess, because that's an interesting question. I think it's, I might have a slightly different answer, but I appreciate you working with me on that. Now I have the harder question.
Okay, sure.
And as we've talked about all of this historical practice and methodology and, you know, and rigor and all of these factors, I just, I'm sorry, I have to know how you think Brian Hale's narrative does on that, because it's hard. It's that, and I don't want to pit you against him. I know, you know, and I'm not asking you to condemn him. Just, I find it to be extremely problematic. I will say, well, anyway, that I've been treated with like what has felt to me like a massively condescending attitude, you know, and I'm not just talking about in our interview. It's gone way beyond that in exchanges, and I really appreciate the work.
You mean in your interview with Brian? Or
yeah, not just in, like, I'm saying it's gone way beyond what was just in the interview.
Oh,
Just the like I've tried to engage so many times, and there's never an engagement. It's always just massive condescending, like condescension. You know, who do you think you are? I'm the expert, and it basically, and you need to be quiet or you need to be excommunicated. You know, and so anyway, so I guess I'm just wondering, because I feel like we take these, like I think that both of, like, Todd Compton is such a nice guy. I don't want to, you know, but when I read his narrative, the rigor's not there. It just isn't. And, you know, and definitely the same thing with Brian. And so what do we do about that with everything you're laying out? Do you find it in those other sources? Do you find those qualifications, that rigor and that approach?
So I think this probably gets more for me into our next discussion, where we're
Okay.
going to go more into the nitty gritty. I mean, I will say that, like, I definitely agree with you that, like we've said, that, I mean, okay, let me use an analogy for how I think about this kind of thing. Not specifically about Brian or Todd, both of whom I know very well, particularly Brian, obviously.
Yeah. And I'm sorry to ask that. I mean, I know this puts you in a tough spot, so thank you. Go ahead.
Sure. So I mentioned earlier that I'd done a book on trying to piece together what we can know about the last 116 pages, the coming forth, where I talked about Martin and Lucy as one example of that. And then we have different sources about what was in them, which is in the second part of the book. But I think I put this in the intro to the book. I put it somewhere. I talked about how I said something like, this book should not be understood as the final word on the last 116 pages. It should be seen more like a first word, the beginning of a discussion. Because the fact is, there'd been basically no scholarship on the subject before that book. Right. So I wasn't going to claim to be the final word. I was opening up sort of a new niche area for scholarship, right? But one of the things that I said after that was, there will be many people who will make further advances in understanding this and help refine interpretations here, add things, change things, and whatnot. And I said, this will be done by a number of people in the future, including by readers of this book. So what I was trying to do there, and I don't know how many readers picked up on this, what I was trying to do was invite readers in to the conversation rather than push readers out, right? I wasn't going to exclude the reader from the conversation. I was trying to invite the reader. I was saying, I'm doing something here. You're going to see what I'm doing. You're going to see my methodology. You're going to see how I'm taking these puzzle pieces and putting them together. I hope that others who read this will pick up on that and carry this forward. And I'll be doing a few more work on it in the future too. But I don't want to be alone in that. I want other people to be doing that.
And that's exactly what I'm doing in my podcast as well, as I'm always asking. But I do feel the exact opposite coming from particularly those two narratives in those books. It's like, here's the information, it's done. Sit back, read what we tell you, and take it. So it's over. It's finished.
Yeah. And the thing is that history's never finished, right? It's never finished. We're going to know a lot more in the future. So so something that I talked about in our first episode that Brian did that I think, I hear so much criticism of Brian Howes. I talked in the first episode about my personal interactions with him.
Yeah, he's great.
Just his deep kindness to me, and other things like that. And I talked about how his faith in the Restoration and his perspective as a Latter-day Saint was so much of what drove him to be willing to engage with these topics, right? This is not a comfortable subject for anybody, but like he went out, he had me mostly do this. He did some himself, but he mostly had me trying to gather every source that had ever been cited in anything that had ever been written about Joseph Smith and polygamy, and then see what other unpublished sources could be found. And in his books, he cites some 1,500 sources, right? And he's made those available on the internet. So there's this treasure trove of information.
Yeah, it's great.
and so he did a lot of grouping of sources. He did a lot of work on like identifying in that mass of sources, well, which ones are talking about Ruth Vos Sayers and her,
Right.
which ones are talking about John C. Bennett. And so he pulled them together and he wove narratives from them. He made interpretations. Sometimes he would send me back to find more sources or do more analysis on a source, or who was the author of this source? What was their bias? What was going on with them? And that all went into his hopper. And the actual writing and crafting of all that was him. Occasionally he used little bits from me where he had me analyze a source. Then I emailed him my analysis and he was like, well, that was so good. Would you mind if I just popped it into the manuscript? So there are little bits that I wrote, but overall, this is Brian's product, right? And so that's what it says on the title page as author, like Brian C. House with the assistance of Don Bradley, because I did research and some source analysis, right? But like, so sorry, I'm trying to remember where I was going with all of that.
I think you just don't, because we were just asking how you think the narrative. I'm not questioning Brian's motives or his goodness. You know, I'm questioning his rigor as a historian.
So particularly what I was going to comment on there is you were saying that the sort of impression that you've gotten from how those are written and what's been said about those books, Todd's book In Sacred Loneliness and Brian's Joseph Smith's Polygamy volumes, the impression you've gotten is this is the narrative, this is it, kind of, it's settled. And so what I was going to say is, if you go back earlier in our conversation today, where I was mentioning someone, again, whom I would highly recommend, right? This book, the epilogues to this book, The Idea of History by Robin Collingwood, for people who are really interested in historical method, doing history, right? He says in there that our knowledge of history does not advance so much by finding new historical sources, but by learning to use better the sources that we have, by finding evidence that's in those sources that we haven't thought was evidence. And so I gave the example earlier of like the book of Isaiah and the Book of Mormon and Isaiah and the JST. Right. The evidence is the manuscripts themselves. We didn't need new historical sources to tell us this. The evidence was already in the manuscripts. It just needed to be mined out. We have like 1,500 sources or more. The evidence is there. We need to mine it out. We need to make better use of it. So what I'm saying is that the work of pulling together all these sources in the research and then doing like interpretation on the level of that has been done so far is actually a beginning point rather than an end point, which doesn't mean that I'm saying, obviously come from my perspective, but I'm not saying I think what this means is, well, Joseph Smith didn't really practice polygamy, and that's the narrative that I expect to ultimately come out. That's not the narrative I expect to come out, right? And we'll get into nitty-gritty about sources and why I think what I think on different things next time. What I'm saying is the kind of research that Brian and that I did and that Brian built on in crafting, piecing things together the way that he did and crafting things, that's really based on the way that Collingwood describes things. That's like
an opening volley.
A great deal of future work that will flesh this subject out much more. Where we take the sources that we've gathered, we take the sources that Brian was able to group together in different topics and different narratives to show how these sources fit together into a narrative about John C. Bennett or about a certain...
Or about William Clayton, because when we're talking about using the sources better and add, I have to keep wanting to say when we talk, like one source that isn't cited is the deed that William Clayton wrote to Hiram on July 12th, 1843, right? And that's a pretty big source. That's a pretty big disruptor to the standard narrative, right? And so I'm sure we'll get into some of those things in the next conversation. So I don't want to go too much, but if we talk about using sources better, like I found that source on the Joseph Smith papers, but the Joseph Smith papers historians knew about it before I did, right? It just hadn't been connected to this question. And so, so I think that that kind of, and that's just one piece, but I think that's a pretty important puzzle piece, say,
Right. Mm-hmm.
that should go into the puzzle, and that should, I guess that's what, let me just ask this, and we're probably getting about ready to wrap up, you know, but let me ask this, like, what would be required to make you reconsider your model?
Right.
And I'm not talking about in a scholarly approach. I'm just saying
Right.
personally, like,
So,
are you open to
right.
reconsidering, and what would it
So
take?
in my notes that I put together for, you know, what to go over with you today, I actually put that question for me and for you. But then I didn't raise the question because as we were going along and I was thinking about it, it seems like that actually, my answer to that would necessarily take me into the very nitty gritty that we're going to get into next time. So instead of answering like with specifics, what I will say is that I am open to, okay, I'm open to a variety of possibilities. I've changed my mind about so many things in the history of the church across time. That should be evident from even just the fact that, like, I left the church for a while. I thought that Joseph Smith, during that time, I thought he was a scoundrel. I don't think that now, right? And so on some very basic points of interpretation about Joseph Smith's character, what he was doing, and so on, I've held radically different viewpoints at different points in my life. So then the question with regard to anything specific, any specific area of interpretation, comes down to how well do I see the data points locking together? How well do I think those puzzle pieces fit together, right? And so if I think that if I'm looking at puzzle pieces and I see them really interlocking the way that I've pieced them together for myself, regardless of how other people may have pieced them together, if the way that I'm seeing is that they fit so well and the picture that's coming out of them is so clear, then consider if you were actually doing a puzzle, right? If you had a bunch of puzzle pieces and you start piecing them together and like they fit perfectly and you're starting to see an image of a red barn, right? And then somebody comes and says, well, no, you're doing it all wrong. This is a picture of, you know, this is actually supposed to be like a Monet painting or something of, you know, a river or something. Like, I'm going to be like, I don't think so, because I see these fitting together and I see a red barn, right? So how much evidence it would take for me to shift my view on something depends on how well I see the pieces interlocking and so on in my current view, right? And so then that would get us into questions about how well do the different data points and sources fit together in what sort of picture would be a question that for us to explore regarding the sources, right? Because that is the kind of question that I want to get into. And it's the kind of question where I want to offer my perspective on that. Like, what would it take for me to change my mind on specific questions here regarding Joseph Smith and polygamy, including the most basic question is, where does Mormon polygamy originate? Does it originate specifically with Joseph Smith, right? And where I would be very interested in hearing more of how you piece together the sources, your view of them, and what it would take to change your view. And I know you have changed your view on this, and we've discussed this, right? That you initially thought Joseph Smith had practiced polygamy. But I think that's a very valuable question for a dialogue and also for other people to hear and to engage with as far as the larger conversation on this. And so I'd love to talk with you about that next time. And it is a question that specifically I've had in mind for us to discuss.
That's excellent. Okay. Well, I think we should probably wrap it up here. We've been at it for a little while, but thank you so much, Don. And I hope our next discussion will be able to be sooner rather than later. I'm really looking forward to it.
Yes. And just, if I could, just on a closing note, I do want to reemphasize that, like, what I want people to see is that I don't want people to feel like when it comes to spirituality that somehow other people are getting in the way between them and God, right? There is a structure to things as far as the church community is concerned, right? but like people have direct access, right? And so people, and certainly of all people, scholars should not be getting in the way of that, right?
Okay.
At all. That's personal, that's direct. And like people also like need to be able to understand if they're going to rely on experts, then I think it's valuable for them to understand why they're relying on the experts, and not just to rely on the experts without some understanding of why. And so again, my point here, like with what I put in my Lost Pages book, is actually to empower people, not to tell them why they should feel disempowered. And so if our conversation on this helps in that regard, right, if people come away from hearing us talk feeling more empowered spiritually and intellectually, that to me is a success in this conversation, as opposed to trying to convince people over a particular viewpoint or not.
I love it. That's beautiful. Thank you for adding that at the end. And I do just want to remind you that I think that Joseph's mask shattering is something we can pay attention to.
It didn't shatter.
So,
Yeah.
I didn't. I actually wanted to say that. I think this is forgive me for being so bratty and forward, but you have the idea almost perfectly right. There's just parts around the edges that maybe need to be, the puzzle can be reinvestigated, right? So I want to keep, that was rude to say it was to you. I just say that's to all of us, to this entire discussion. We need to be willing to reconsider the mask that we've created for Joseph Smith. So
absolutely.
Thank you, Don. I really appreciate it. One more huge thank you to Don Bradley for being willing to give us so much time and to engage on these difficult topics. I really appreciate his thoughtful, careful approach to these conversations, and I am so looking forward to our continuing conversations going forward. Remember to tune in next week for the 2-year anniversary episode, and then there's a lot more really challenging and hopefully very valuable content coming after that. So thank you so much for being here, and I will see you next time.